I cannot honestly say that the process of doubting my religion and doubting my belief in a supreme being, at least the one that I preached and was preached in the denomination I was a part of, that was not scary. But what was scary was definitely, I mean, a lot of my identity was tied up in being a minister.
Well, Tim Landry, thank you so much for joining me on Growing Up Fundie. I'm so excited that you reached out and you filled out my little form here to be on an episode, because I literally cannot think of somebody who is better suited for this type of conversation, this type of discussion. For people who don't know, which would be strange if they did, we have actually known each other for, I think we determined, over 10 years now at this point, probably closer to
some time, yes.
Probably closer to 12. We were both in debate. I started as a novice and ended pro, and I think you might have been pro the whole time that I was involved. Am I wrong about that? Am I right?
That's true. I suppose Kevin Ells, who was the debate coach at LSU Alexandria, with my age, as we were talking before the show, I started undergrad. I was a history major. I started undergrad in 2009.
That's amazing.
When I was 51. And I suppose, seeing my age, Coach Ells pretty well concluded, hey, you're going to be in the professional division, which of course was debating a lot of debate coaches and older folks.
Yeah. And I think it's phenomenal that you went from starting your undergrad in 2009 to now teaching history at LSU. That's wild. Like, you should be so proud of yourself. I hope that you are, because I think that is just so cool. I think that's amazing. So congratulations.
Well, going back to my days as a minister, Sydney, I'll pull up or I'll resurrect a term we used back then.
Love it.
Sanctified Proud, which I guess is supposed to mean you're not proud in an unhealthy way. But yes, I will say this, as I told you before the show, there are times I stop and reflect, and to me, it's a dream come true. I almost have to pinch myself saying, hey, I'm teaching history at LSU.
Yeah. And you also haven't aged today, which is very confusing. And I need to know your secret off the record whenever we're done here, because that I need to harness whatever the power is that you've got.
I wish I could tell you if that is the case, but I'll just say I do appreciate your compliment, whether deserved or not. If my physical appearance seems that I have an age, I promise you, many times, physically, I feel every bit of my 66 years.
Wow, 66. I would not have guessed. That's amazing. So you, and correct me if I'm wrong, you used to be a Pentecostal preacher, and now you're agnostic. That is quite the journey. Am I correct about that? Did I read the notes wrong?
Yes. If we're using quick terminology, Sydney, that would sum it up. I don't care for a lot of these categories, or again, to resurrect another term from my seminary days, straight out of high school. I had a professor that said, we can't put people in little boxes. And if you don't mind, just elaborating on this agnostic term. I know there's a scholarly accurate definition, But as far as the way I'd apply it to me, and yes, I think it is accurate. Um, but and we're as you said, we're both old, experienced, competitive debaters, and
Yes.
I am remembering a book I read. It was a debate between a man named Thomas Warren, who was quite a well known debater in the Church of Christ. He was a Church of Christ minister.
Interesting.
And they're pretty well known for religious debates. In fact, that's where I don't want to say cut my teeth, but yes, that's where I got started debating, and quite a bit different with
Interesting.
30, quite a bit different from IPDA with 30-minute speeches uh,
Wow.
at one time. Yes,
Wow.
but what I was saying, the book I was reading. He was debating an atheist. But as you know, in IPDA, we get when you go over your proposition with your opponent before the round. Certainly, you want to have a good understanding where you're on common ground with the terms of the proposition, where there's
Yes.
no misunderstanding. Well, I had to admire the proposition um, that they were debating. It was, and the atheist was in the affirmative here, but the proposition was um, resolved: the God of the New Testament, who will eternally punish people in hell, does not exist. Uh,
Oh,
and I thought that was pretty. I thought that was accurate, and I would have to say, as far as my agnosticism, yes, I have my doubts these days that fellow exists. I don't feel that I am anti-religious, or
yeah.
even to be more specific, I don't feel that I am anti Christian religion, but
Yeah.
something else I remember from that book, and I wish I still had it. And one thing I regret, Sydney, I had an extensive ministerial library, and when I left the ministry, I gave it away to a
Oh.
ministerial friend, and I wish I had
Oh,
done so. I could really
man.
use, yeah, I could really use those Greek lexicons and Hebrew
Yes.
lexicons now. But
Yes.
what I remember reading also, the way the atheist debater concluded, he said, if there is a God or a deity, a supreme being, when I look at the beauty of this earth, Yosemite National Park, the oceans, the mountains, then how wonderful a being he must be. And yes, I think I could go along with that. So just a little elaboration there on how
Yeah.
I would apply the term agnostic to myself.
Interesting. And for anybody who's listening to this and maybe they're not as familiar with debate as we are, what I think is interesting about that topic is it gives the atheist the opportunity to only argue that there is no God who would send people to hell. He doesn't have to argue that there is no God. It goes into the semantics, really. He just has to argue based on whatever evidence he thinks he has that there's just not a god in existence that would send people to hell or that would damn people. And when it comes to debate, you were talking about defining the terms. Basically what happens is, and this is just for people unfamiliar, you have to define terminology that's being used in the topic. And I have found that that's important even in real life, to say, you make a statement like, I don't believe in God. I being me, believe being what? What does believe mean for the sake of this conversation? God being who? The Christian God, any gods, deities? Because when you break down those definitions, it turns out a lot of times people agree about the same things. So you have to define specifically what it is you're talking about. Otherwise, it's cyclical, or it just takes forever to get nowhere, or you find that you're arguing about the same thing. And so when you told me that was the topic, I was like, ooh, my brain immediately went in 8 different directions that topic could go, when a non-debater might look at it and think it means God doesn't exist. And it's like, no, look deeper into that.
Right. That would certainly be probably too general a proposition. God does not exist.
Yes.
And you had to admire Mr. Warren, the Church of Christ minister. And I say Mr., those of you listening, if you are Church of Christ, you know that their ministers do not use the term reverend.
Interesting.
But yes, you had to admire Thomas Warren in that he readily signed the negative to that proposition. So when it was flipped, I suppose the next night, he was all too happy to affirm that the God who will punish, of the New Testament, who will punish people eternally in hell, does exist.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's also the interesting idea that by saying of the New Testament, you rule out any evidence somebody can use from the Old Testament. Like the debater in me is going, oh, there's like so many things they're doing here. They're like weaseling it down. That's
Yes,
very, and
and I
so
suppose, Sydney, that well, with your religious background, no doubt you're familiar with this also. But the fact that so many things in the Old Testament were allegedly fulfilled in the New Testament, at least according to one mainstream line of fundamentalist Christian thought, then yes, you may as well focus on, for purposes of that debate and that proposition, you may as well focus on the New Testament.
yeah, yeah. And there are some religions even that, or I guess I shouldn't say religions, there are some denominations that really only want to focus on the New Testament. And when you bring up the Old Testament, they're like, no, we don't even listen to that anymore. Somebody said to me the other day, the Old Testament is expired. And I was like, that's just wild. It's wild to me. Because I was raised Southern Baptist, and to me, the Old Testament was like a whole big part of it. So the fact that somebody else can say, no, it's expired, we don't really listen to that part, we just skip to the New Testament, bananas to me.
Yeah, well, in fact, our religious backgrounds, no doubt, our respective denominations looked at things pretty much the same when it came to prophecy, and again, Old Testament prophecies being fulfilled in the New Testament.
Yeah. And something you said earlier also that I thought was important to define as well was you said that you're not anti-God and you're not anti-Christian. And I think that there is a common misconception that when somebody says they're an agnostic or an atheist, that they're anti-God or that they're anti-religion. And I would like to just throw out there to anybody listening who maybe they're religious, maybe they're on the fence, that does not mean that you're anti-God. That just means that you simply do not believe that such a thing exists. That's like saying anti-Santa Claus. Like nobody's out here saying they're anti-Santa Claus. Nobody's against Santa Claus.
Correct.
It's more like, I sincerely just don't think that a God is there. I don't dislike the man. I don't have any issue with him. You can't be anti something you don't think is real. And
Correct.
so,
Certainly, that's certainly a good point.
yeah.
And
So, yeah, I just didn't want anybody to think atheists are like anti-God, picketing against him, because truly
right.
not most of the time.
Well, and speaking as a, well, I don't want to say, I was about to say speaking as a history professor, Sydney, but to be more accurate, looking back, when I studied history, well, I still study history, it's an ongoing process, but looking back at some of my classes in undergrad and then graduate school at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, shout out to them, and at LSU. Now, my research wheelhouse is 20th century American political history, but I'm going to kind of draw on, this not anti-religious thing. I'm going to kind of draw on some of my studies in Western civilization, uh, looking back at early modern Europe, and this is nothing esoteric; it's pretty well common knowledge. But in making a point here, yes, I am. I think these days, Sydney, if we are elaborating on my agnosticism, I'm very much a child of the Enlightenment.
Interesting.
And what the Enlightenment was, now it was an intellectual and philosophical movement that kind of got started in the coffee houses of Europe um, in the 1400s, again, the 1500s, the um, early modern age. Actually, I'm going further back. That's the scientific revolution, kind of in the 1600s, 1700s. And the Enlightenment was a reaction against this oppressive religious thought and the idea that, well, you hand over your brain and let the priest or the minister do the thinking for you. But, the general Enlightenment philosophy, and again, it wasn't anti God, it was God gave you, eyes to see, ears to hear, a nose to smell, I suppose. And he would not have given that to you if he did not expect you to forsake, or if he did not expect you to use them. So, yes, I'm very much a believer these days in empirical evidence, in that
Interesting.
what you believe in is, yeah, what you can see, what you can hear, and, that there's some tangible evidence for it. However, it's very important to note that, once again, the Enlightenment, while it was a reaction against religious oppression and fanaticism, the Enlightenment was not an anti religious movement. Voltaire, the French philosopher, his philosophy was God as a clockmaker. He was not an atheist, but the idea that, okay, God created the universe, but then, like the clockmaker, after he makes the clock, he winds it and lets it run. And that was his view of the universe, deism. And yes, without going into a long digression, our founding fathers, as we use the term, of the United States were deists. That was their view of God, and that's what they poured into the Declaration and the Constitution. But in the Enlightenment, it was also a time of flourishing religious thought and religious art and religious music. For example, something I'm sure you're familiar with, and many of our listeners are. Well, he was German by birth, but really an Englishman, grew up in England. Frederick Handel, who wrote that piece, The Messiah, and particularly one piece, the Hallelujah Chorus. That was composed in that time of religious flourishing in the Enlightenment. So, once again, as a child of the Enlightenment, I am certainly happy for any religious enlightenment that is included in that in early modern Europe, but spreading across the Atlantic and, even even today.
So because of that, everything you're saying sounds like somebody who would be a devout religious person for life. So how did you, or how old were you, or how long ago did you realize that not only was the ministry not for you, but religion necessarily was not for you?
Um, well, I tell you, Sydney, and my leaving the United Pentecostal Church and leaving the Pentecostal ministry um, was really had its roots in a practical way to make a living. Now, I went through a divorce in 1991, and no stones to throw there. Both my ex-wife and I were human,
Yeah.
with human failings.
Yeah.
I will say this: I was pastor of a church in central Louisiana. Things were not going real well with my pastorate. It did put a lot of pressure on my wife and I
Yeah.
and our marriage. So again, we divorced. And in the United Pentecostal Church, now I don't know how it is these days in the Southern Baptist Church. I'm sure they may look at it closely, but in the United Pentecostal Church, at least 30 some years ago, yeah, an ordained minister that divorces, you're pretty well done for
Yeah.
in the ministry. So
That was my first question. I was like, well, how'd that go?
yeah, so I pretty well accepted it. I had to make a living, and I will say this: I think I found out. Now I was only speaking half in jest when I said about being a college professor that they have to pay me to grade
Yeah.
and deal with, I'm thrilled dealing with students, but they have to pay me to grade. Now, lecturing, I would do it free.
Yes.
There was a
Yes.
parallel there with the ministry that preaching, getting up behind the pulpit, man, I love that. But dealing with people and, one minister friend said, and yes, there is some truth to that. I don't want to get too cynical, but he said, people talking about, being a pastor, leading people, trying to manage things. He said, people are Christian until you cross them. Well, that may be a bit cynical, but yes, I was not unhappy to leave that aspect of it behind. Well, to make a long story short, I began um, a career in the car business that lasted for 20 years. I began
Wow.
as a salesman in Alexandria, Louisiana, which was where most of my career took place. Moved up to being finance manager and sales manager. And yes, the car business, at least back in the 90s, was a career that someone without a lot of education, which was me at the time, in a particular field, could enter into and make a fairly decent living. Well, to make a long story short, I remained in the car business until about March of 2009 when I left uh, to start college. So, yes, that was kind of the beginning um, of the journey. Really, just a practical way to make a living. And over that time, again, my personal belief system began to change. I don't know uh, if this should be the criterion for someone like me to go again from being in the ministry to being pretty much a non-believer, at least as far as fundamentalist Christianity. But I'll elaborate on a couple things. So first of all, as I say, I don't know if this is a good criterion, but seeing the inconsistencies and that some people, claiming to be Christian weren't really that, but then justified that. Now I know, people could come back. Oh well, there's hypocrites in, um, every movement. But yes, that was um, an influence on, my belief system um, beginning to change. So yeah, I guess kind of ran concurrent with me in another career. And yes, as far as that goes, every individual, I think if they are a thinking individual, you are probably going to redefine yourself maybe two or three different times in your life. Now, uh, but I tell you, before we move on, Sydney,
Mhm.
I think it only fair where it's not. It doesn't seem like I'm dodging your question. Let me deal with talk about some theology
Sure.
here. And I know, you're Southern Baptist. Well, of course, it's a fundamentalist religion, and not getting too much into United Pentecostal theology, but um, salvation is looked at as a three-step process by all, for and it's not simply salvation by faith, but Acts 2:38 is kind of the foundational um, verse, and that is, then Peter said unto them at this big meeting on the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. Well, the way that's interpreted, yes, the first step, you have to repent of your sins. The second step, where now, comparing this baptismal theology with the Baptist, you are baptized by immersion as evidence or as confirmation that you are saved. I don't want to get into theological hair splitting, but UPC view of that and Church of Christ view of that is that you are baptized in order to obtain remission of sins. In other words, if you get baptized, you're not saved. Well, then added to that, you shall receive the gift of the Holy Ghost. That is necessary for salvation, and the evidence of it is speaking in other tongues. All three of those are necessary for salvation, but I begin to wonder about some of these things even when I was in the ministry. Then you'd hear, oh, if you don't pay your tithes, you're going to hell. Women, if you cut your hair, you're going to hell. The Bible says, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together. If you don't come to church, you're going to hell. So you may as well, I thought to myself, man, you may as well make it a 6 or 7 or 8 step plan of salvation, because logically, these other things you throw in there are part of the plan of salvation. Now, that's, one of the main areas that, I just began to have my
Yeah.
doubts. And
Yeah.
as far as throwing out, mentioning a good friend of both of ours, yes, and of course, while he is still a Christian believer. As far as United Pentecostal theology, yes, Scott Lloyd could also give a pretty good
Yes.
analysis of this. But yes, those are so practical. A practical way to make a living, led me out uh, of the ministry, and then having my doubts over, that period of years and decades, Sydney. I guess that's the best way I can describe the process.
Yeah. And did those doubts, were they painful or were they scary at all? Or did you just kind of see them for what they were? How did you feel as you were going through that deconstruction process?
Well, what was scary, Sydney? I cannot honestly say that the process of doubting my religion and doubting my belief in a supreme being, at least the one that I preached and was preached in the denomination I was a part of, that was not scary. But what was scary is, was definitely, I mean, a lot of my identity was tied up in
Yes.
being a minister, being a preacher. And of course, that's not unique to the ministry. I think we tie
Right.
up a lot of our identity in our careers, our job choice,
Yes.
which is good. And in fairness, like I say, that wasn't unique to the ministry. Now, I was sales manager and finance manager for about 14 years of my 20-year career at the Lincoln Mercury dealership. Well, he's retired now, the dealer, John Decker Lincoln Mercury. And really in a high pressure, being a manager in the car business at retail, it's got about the job security of a football coach. You can say there's two kind of managers in the car business: those that have been fired and those that are gonna be fired. Well, so looking back, I feel extremely fortunate. I was able to work at one dealership for about 14 years. But then
Wow.
when John Decker retired, um, another dealer in town bought the dealership, but brought in his own management. I was gone, and once again, man, so much of my life and my ego was tied up in that job, and now I don't have it. So that um, can certainly be a difficult thing, and really, that I think was the most scary thing, was really the
Yeah.
career change rather than my belief system change.
Yeah. And did you feel at any point, or have you felt before, like you had to come clean or tell people, or in a sense, kind of come out of that closet as a non-believer? Or is it something that you didn't feel was necessary to really tell anybody?
I did not go out of my way to do that, Sydney. And really, in my particular case, I think it was, pretty common knowledge that, yeah, Tim Landry is not in the church anymore. In fact, when I was younger and first got out, yeah, my lifestyle changed quite uh, radically. I guess, being older now, I've kind of mellowed on a lot of that stuff. But
What were some of the
yes,
biggest
so,
changes?
I'm sorry.
What were some of the biggest changes? What were some of the more like radical changes that you saw?
Well, and again, I don't suppose it was really radical, but I became a social drinker. Began
That's shocking. I'm
kind of,
clutching my pearls.
yeah. Um, and of course, I was. I'll just put it this way. I was a relatively young single man. In a new lifestyle. So let's just say that I indulged in some obvious aspects um, of that. So, as I say, at least as far as my former circle, it was pretty well common knowledge. But no, that aside, no, Sydney, I did not ever feel an obligation to have to go out of my way and say, hey, I'm not a believer anymore. But I was not hesitant to discuss that had, the subject ever came up. And of course, I had been asked the question by friends who are still friends that, what made you leave the ministry and quote the church? And, so again, I certainly did not mind discussing it if the subject came up.
Yeah. And did they react negatively in any way, or did most people seem to just kind of respect your decision? I wasn't sure if you lost any friends over that choice.
Honestly, Sydney, looking back, now I've always pretty well been a lone wolf. And if I lost any friends, it was more just again that now we're living completely different lifestyles. I don't know that anyone really shunned me, at least to my face. Now behind my back, there's no telling what may have been said, but I don't recall just a lot of negativity, with my belief system change and my lifestyle change. So again, at least to my face, no one acted uh, excessively harsh or negative. Now, what I do see a lot, and I have a good friend whom I will not call her name, but I found it quite interesting that my friend back 30 years ago, yeah, she was pretty well, uh, a wild child, if you want to use that expression. But now, she is very much a devout Christian, church, which,
Interesting.
hey, all the more power to her. But the reason I brought her up was on my Facebook page, I had posted a newspaper article in the Alexandria Daily Town Talk back when a feature story on me back when I was in the ministry. Well, my friend read that and, sent me a message saying, oh, well, I wish that I had known you back when you were a minister because we'd have so much in common to talk about. And we're still friends today. But yes, it's, I guess, rather remarkable. I went that way and she went the opposite way. So, no, it wasn't
Yeah.
negative, but yeah, she said, I wish I had known you back when we had, or when we would have had the same Christian belief system.
I feel like that's the closest to an insult you're going to get from like classy people living in Louisiana, like Southern Belle style. That's like the closest to insulting you can possibly get.
Probably so.
In that, yeah. And so you seem what I really am enjoying about this conversation is most of the time when I speak to people who were former members of the ministry or heavily involved in their faith to some degree, who later deconstructed and basically lost that religion, kind of shed that belief system, most of them have a story of like pain and a little bit of confusion and like sadness, but you just seem very matter of fact. Like you just seem like it really didn't negatively impact you in any way. And I just think that's fascinating. Would you say that's true? Or have you just worked through it to a point now where you just don't dwell on that anymore?
It's mostly true, Sydney. I don't want to leave a wrong impression, but I have to honestly say from my heart that, again, the biggest adjustment for me and the biggest source of, I guess, worry and where I felt the most lost in those first couple years was, hey, oh man, I'm not a preacher anymore.
Right.
I went to seminary for it. And yes, and the reason I say I started college in 2009, now the Bible school that I went to in Jackson, Mississippi, was an unaccredited Bible college for purpose of preparing United Pentecostal youth for some kind of service in ministry. But yes, my biggest, again, source of pain uh, was probably looking back on it, losing a career and thinking, man, I don't have an identity anymore. But again,
Yeah.
honestly, I felt the same way when, I left, when I got laid off or replaced or whatever at the Lincoln Mercury dealership after 14 years after the corporate
Wow.
buyout.
Yeah. So with you, it was less of an existential crisis and more of a like, who am I now? Because I've been this person with this label for so long. How do I even begin to figure out who I am now? As
Yeah,
opposed
I
to,
think I think that's accurate.
would you say that there's any relief at all? Or maybe the better question is, do you think that there might potentially be heaven or hell? Or if not, is there a relief there that you no longer believe those things?
Um, yeah, I suppose we could look back at the uh, I forget the artist's name, but the old song from my elementary school days, and I'm partial to '60s music. What does it say? I can swear there ain't no heaven, and I pray uh, there ain't no hell. But yeah, and I don't mean to be. Um, and again, I'm honestly not trying to be matter of fact, Sydney, but
Nope.
again, being an empiricist, I don't think that that it's a matter of relief, but it's just, I think that's the way it is.
Yeah.
Again, and if I had to, uh, and talking about the Enlightenment and going back to the scientific revolution, uh, another thing in history that affected me a lot was, again, what was called the scientific method. The idea that, yes, you state a hypothesis, then you experiment. You change your hypothesis based on the evidence of your experiments. So you change your beliefs based on the evidence. You don't try to fit the evidence um, to your beliefs. So and it's just like people, oh, evolution, it's just a theory, but a theory in its core scientific definition, it's something that has been tested thousands and thousands and thousands of times. And it's just to be intellectually honest, you can't say, yes, it is a definite fact, but the evidence um, is so overwhelming that, yes, I would have to apply that to, quote, let's say, the heaven and the hell of the Bible. Feelings don't really enter into it.
That's a good point.
Just
That's
don't see
like
these days that there's evidence for it to exist.
that's a really good point. It's less about how I feel or how I think and more about, listen, the evidence tells me this. And I like what you said basically about how you never really want to speak in absolutes. You never want to say there 100% isn't, but if we're going based on the facts and the evidence that are presented to us, I would say there isn't. But much like science does, it changes constantly. So you don't want to say this will never be a thing, because maybe one day science and evidence tells us something totally different than what we thought. I feel like we learn new things every day that are different to what we thought in the past.
Oh,
But
correct.
yeah,
And
but
this business of a theory, which applying it to the theory of evolution, what I've done with an illustration I've used with my classes in my Western civilization classes. And by the way, a shout out, in addition to teaching history at LSU, I also teach history at River Parishes Community College in Gonzales, Louisiana, which is where I teach more European history there. But an illustration I used regarding, say, the theory of evolution, I would say, okay, guys, what happens, and this happens more often than not, what happens when you come into the classroom and Professor Landry is nowhere to be seen, but you can look and you can see the PowerPoint is turned on to the opening slide of the lecture. You see my LSU windbreaker draped across the back of my chair. What do you conclude? Do you conclude that, hey, well, Professor Landry's not here? And obviously they say no. I mean, we could, well, you're off somewhere, but yeah, you're definitely here, ready for class. And then I say, but now wait, is it absolutely impossible that I was kidnapped and then the kidnappers came in and turned on the slide and put my jacket over the chair? Is that absolutely scientifically impossible? And of course, the answer is no. So yeah, you can't say, well, it's 100% scientifically certain, Professor Lamb, but yeah, it's what, 99.99999% based on the evidence that
that's
he's here.
funny.
So yes, we can apply that to the scientific use of the word theory, empirical evidence. Yeah, there's his code. Hey, the PowerPoints are ready to go. So yes, I would stake my life that the professor, is here on campus somewhere.
That's really funny. I like that. I like that a lot. Have you found, being in Louisiana, which for anybody living in the South or probably people living out of the South know, there are certain stereotypes in terms of which states are very religious, which states are devoutly fundamentalist and evangelical. Would you say that you've run into any scenarios where religion has impacted you trying to teach history, where anybody's maybe come back and said, I don't believe this, and maybe they've been a very religious person, or they've been upset with you for phrasing things a certain way? Does that happen often?
Well, not religion specifically, Sydney, that I can think of. Now, I remember when I was in the 10th grade, way back in 1972, that I wrote, on a piece of paper to my biology teacher, now you're not going to teach me evolution no way that I believe that I came from a monkey. So now that question may be better served being asked of a science teacher. Now, I will
True.
say this, and probably not, uh, we can delve into it if you want, but I will say this. Now, things are beginning to happen, not necessarily from a religious standpoint, even though that may no doubt play a part in it, the way with the state of the country in 2023. But I have heard And in this particular case, it was a staff member and not at LSU or RPCC. And since I'm telling this, I'll be quiet about the other particular place institution that I've taught. But a particular staff member had complained to the campus director when I taught about American history, teaching about slavery, that, oh, he's propagating white guilt and with all this emphasis on slavery. And hey, who knows, in Louisiana, after this last gubernatorial election, what the state of higher education will be facing, because yes, there is definitely a movement that no, you can't teach this or can't teach that, in an effort at silencing, which I think that applies more to the teaching of history at the college level than just straight religious
Right.
belief.
Interesting. And also, I've always thought that if somebody has a problem with something like that, and the problem is not that it's infactual, like it literally never happened. The problem is more that they don't want us to talk about it. I feel like that says a lot more about the person than it does. Do you see what I'm saying? Like when somebody says he's trying to teach slavery to people and that's going to make us feel guilty, I don't want him to talk about slavery, as opposed to it never happened. You're admitting it happened. You're admitting we did this. You just don't want to talk about it anymore. That to me is like worse even, I think, than people that are in denial of history, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Sydney. And unfortunately, we can expand that from saying, well, a particular person feels this way, but unfortunately, we can expand that to saying a particular movement or persuasion feels this way. That yes, we want to try to silence you into teaching history. And of course, all the rage. Now, I haven't heard that much about it lately. It seems like perhaps some have moved on, at least temporarily, to something else. But they're teaching critical race theory, and then most of these people, you ask them, well, what is critical race theory? Don't really know.
Yeah, that's, gosh. If you're going to be up in arms about something, know what it is.
Correct. And it's those challenges that I think that we as history professors would face more and yes, higher education is being challenged, but it would be more along those lines for the history school rather than maybe just pure religion. Well, I'm a Christian and don't like you teaching that, but it's certainly, there are probably areas that could be applied.
Yeah, but that's actually a really good point. I never considered that. The idea that certain ideologies might attack you less than actual religious belief systems. Those, like you pointed out a great point when you said that's more towards the science teachers to kind of battle with what the Bible says or what religion says versus what science says, as opposed to history, where it's more groups and ideologies that aren't necessarily religious based, but maybe we find often go hand in hand with also religious beliefs, just maybe by chance, maybe for a reason, maybe just statistically. That's a really good point, that might not impact you as much as it would impact, say, somebody who's trying to teach evolution.
Correct. And there's certainly some overlapping.
Yeah.
And in fact, again, this challenging of education or wanting to direct it by governors or legislatures or churches. What was it in Florida? They were challenging math books because supposedly, I guess the way math problems were worded, if you remember those word math problems, but the way math problems were worded was adhering to a quote unquote woke agenda, or whatever. So I guess, yeah, even math is not uh, safe from those kind of challenges.
Yes. Yes. I would think, I would assume that anything that makes people feel, I don't want to use the word dumb, or I don't want to use the word stupid, but I've noticed that anytime something challenges somebody's intelligence, anytime something makes somebody feel less than the smartest person in the room, they oftentimes fight back at it, as opposed to learning from it or exploring it more or breaking it down in a way where they think, oh, this doesn't make any sense. Why is this like this? Maybe I can learn from it. I've noticed that there are people like you and I who, when we don't understand something, we go diving deep into it. We say, I want to figure out more about this. I want to break this down. And then there are people that say, I don't want to hear this ever again because it made me feel in a way that I can't articulate clearly. So instead of learning why it is I can't articulate how I feel or changing that, I just never want to hear this thing again, whether it's a history lesson, a science lesson, a math lesson, and they ban that as opposed to finding it interesting or wondering how it is that they can stop from feeling that way whenever they're confronted with that information.
Yes, that's a very good point. And it does seem these days, Sydney, that at least what I see, it's not so much perhaps that people feel, oh, well, this makes me feel not intelligent, but this makes me, with regard to history specifically, and to be more specific, let's say American history, when you talk about, and to be more specific on the subjects, let's say you talk about slavery, you talk about the treatment and the genocide of the Native Americans. Then people say, not so much this makes me feel unintelligent, but this makes me feel uncomfortable.
Yes.
And I hope that, say for you and me, as you said, that I hope that if we confront something that we don't understand, that we dig deeper into it. And I also hope that for me, that if I confront a piece of history, let's say, that the evidence is that it happened and it makes me uncomfortable, that I also will feel, hey, I need to dig deeper into this and engage with it and not, turn from it and try to use any influence by saying, well, this can't be taught, or, this can't be articulated.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And I try to explain to people that I am who I am today because people were willing to make me uncomfortable in that way, in that educational way. I owe who I am as a person to people who were willing to say, oh, sorry, my dog is having a dream. Zilla, wake up. She barks in her sleep. But I owe everything that I am today as a person to people who were willing to say, now, why would you say that? Why would you think that? Where did you read that? Would you be surprised to find out that you're actually incorrect about that? But I would love to show you how it really is, as opposed to, oh, you're dumb, you're stupid, this is the truth, you're so lame. Debate really opened my eyes to, one, research, because for anybody who's listening who doesn't know what IPDA style is, we didn't even get to pick what side of an argument we were going to be on. We were told, you're for this or you're against it, research, defend it, may the best man win. Mm-hmm. And I found through a lot of that research that I was forced to do against things that I thought I agreed with, that I didn't actually agree with much of it at all. And it was very uncomfortable to stand there and debate against things that I thought were my identity or I thought were my belief system. And so, through a combination of people having those discussions with me and not letting me off the hook just because I'm uncomfortable and I don't want to have this conversation, and debate saying, no, you're going to spend the next 30 minutes to an hour researching this thing that you thought you knew so well, and you need to sound like you believe it too.
Oh, correct.
It changed my life. Changed my life 100%.
In fact, talking about debating styles, Sydney, the old, I guess, National Forensic League for many, many years, I think they governed like high school debate nationally. And you had one national topic. Let's say it's better to rent a home than buy a home. But yes, that was the topic. And you had to, each debate team, each debater had to build an affirmative case and a negative case and know the topic inside out from both sides, which certainly is quite healthy.
Yeah.
And anyway, since I mentioned him, that reminds me. Um, a little shout out again to Scott Lloyd. I debated him, I think, at that same Sam Houston tournament where I judged one of your out rounds. But at any rate, our topic, which he was the affirmative, I don't remember the exact words of the proposition, but it had something to do with pornography is good. And boy, I was just licking my tongue. Man, I got a preacher here, and he's got to affirm pornography is good. Man, this is going to be the easiest round I ever won. And he actually won the round. So I had to, hand it to him there.
Yes.
A preacher affirming that whatever the wording was, pornography was some kind of positive thing, but he won the round. So yes, he was able to critically think and be objective, at least enough to beat me in that debate round.
Yeah. One thing I'll say about Scott is before he was such a good friend of mine, he was my worst enemy as a debater. Because I remember he was so good that he would make me so mad. I don't know how many times after a debate with Scott, I would walk into the prep room and like throw a folder across the room. And Jim would maybe go pick it up. He'd be like, Sydney, settle down, like be a professional. Because he's just so good at that. He's such a good debater. I remember you are such a good debater. And like I remember like as an adult, I've become good friends with him and I highly respect the man. But as a 21-year-old or a 22-year-old, man, that guy used to get under my skin, but in the most complimentary way because he was so good at what he did. And that's prime example of how instead of befriending him and asking him what I could do better, did he have any feedback, critique of any kind? I instead was like, that made me uncomfortable and I didn't like that experience and I'm going to put it out of my head and learn nothing from it. But luckily,
I
we're
certainly know
friends
the
now.
feeling of being frustrated. Yeah, there were just some debaters that had my number.
Yes, 100%. Well, Tim, if you had any advice for somebody listening to this, and maybe they were very much like you, where their entire identity was tied up in a church of some kind. Maybe it wasn't Pentecostalism, but maybe it was something else. And they no longer believe that way and they're feeling a little bit lost. What would you say to somebody just to give them a peace of mind or direction to head in from here?
I would say, do not feel condemned by the journey you're on. And yes, it is a journey. Think, read, um, and study. You may not have all the answers that you need at the present time, at this point in time in your journey. But the answers will come. And I certainly Sydney, could not judge each person's individual journey or what they may be trying to come out of. And when I say this, I am certainly not broad brushing every church
Sure.
or every religious movement. But yes, if you are in an unhealthy situation for you, your children, your family, I would encourage you to get out from that and don't a particular cultic situation, which is not every religion. Don't
Right.
again, as I think that's been a good theme, and I appreciate you bringing our conversation, making that kind of one of the overall themes, Sydney. And that no, this is not an anti-religion or even anti-Christianity session. It's like the old country / gospel song said, you've got to walk that lonesome valley. You've got to walk it by yourself. No one else can walk it for you. You've got to walk it by yourself. But again, from a child of the Enlightenment, you have, or you were given, eyes to see, ears to hear, a brain to think. And if you use those, and you base your belief system and your lifestyle on the evidence that you see and hear, and can critically think and analyze, you will walk along the route that you're supposed to be walking on. So I think that's what I would say.
That was a poetic ending just then. What a beautiful way to say that, Tim. For anybody listening, if you have questions for Tim or comments or feedback, feel free to email me wherever you're listening or watching. There will be the opportunity to contact me. My form is in there. Or you can post comments, say you're watching this on YouTube, and I will make sure that Tim gets your questions and your comments. And maybe I already am thinking of other reasons to have you back, Tim, for a part 1, part 2, part 3.
I look forward to it.
You got to walk that lonesome valley. Well, you got to walk it for yourself. Ain't nobody here can walk it for you. You got to walk the that valley for yourself. My mother had to walk that lonesome valley. Well, she had to walk it for herself. It's nobody here could walk it for her. Yeah, she had to walk the that valley.